Hot cross buns, hot cross buns. 1 a penny, 2 a penny, hot cross buns. Today we are going to be making a Easter hot cross bun pincushion. Let's go. Now, let's go through the list of ingredients we will need to make this bad boy. So, we will need a rotary blade and cutting mat or some dressmaking shears, a friction pen or some tailor's chalk to mark on our fabric. We will need some pins or some fabric clips to hold our fabric together whilst we sew. We will need some snips. We'll need a quilting ruler, a sewing machine, an iron and wool pressing mat, and some pillow fill. Now, let's take a look at what fabrics we'll need for this project. We will need a 9" by 3" piece of light brown cotton fabric, a 7" by 3" piece of dark brown cotton fabric, a 16" by 3" piece of fusible interfacing, 2 pieces of white or cream coloured ribbon measuring at about 1 centimetre wide but 7 inches long. You'll also need a light brown or cream coloured thread for our machine. You'll also need a hand sewing needle for finishing off our project later on. So, the first step in our project is adhering our fabric to our fusible interfacing. So what we'll do is we'll take our fabric, align the edge of our fusible interfacing with the edge of our fabric, give it just a smooth out like so to make sure it's sitting nice and flat. And then we take our second piece of fabric and do exactly the same. It's also important to mention that when we are laying up our fabric, we make sure that the adhesive side, which is indicated by a shiny texture, is facing upwards, and the wrong side of our fabric is facing down onto that adhesive side. So, it should look something like that. Next, we'll take our iron and making sure that our fabric is sitting with the edges butting up against each other, we'll take our iron and just apply that heat that will melt the glue. I like to do quite a few presses of this, just to make sure that all the fabric is entirely stuck down. So I'll just make sure. Yep, that's perfectly adhered. And now we move on to marking. All right. So for this, we are going to need our erasable fabric marker or our tailor's chalk and our quilting ruler. The first step in this process is flipping over our piece of fabric like so. And what I'll do is then take my quilting ruler and line up that 3" mark with the edge of my fabric. I like to make sure that it's sitting nice and straight. There we go, beautiful. And what I'll do is just put my first marker there. So you should have a 3" by 3" square for our first mark. We then follow on from that mark by lining up that line we've just drawn with our 1.5 measurement, and then we draw another line. We will repeat that process another 2 times. And yep, I can see now just our line dividing from our light brown fabric to our dark brown fabric. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 rectangles that measure at 3 inches by 1.5 inches and a square that is 3 inches squared. What I'll then do is flip our fabric around and then draw another 3 inch by 3 inch box. And then for our light brown fabric, I'm just going to line up our 1 inch measurement with that line we've just drawn. And follow the same process that we followed for our 1.5 inch mark. So I'm going to do another 3 lines. Beautiful. So now that we've finished with marking, we're going to move on to cutting out our squares and our rectangles. Now, I'm going to be using a ruler, rotary blade, and cutting mat, but if you're using tailor's shears or dressmaking shears, that's totally fine. So, we'll begin to cut out our squares and rectangles using those lines we've just drawn as our cut lines. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm going right to left, it's not a tactic, it's not a little hack, I'm simply just left-handed. Alright, now that I've finished cutting, I'm going to flip all my pieces up to make sure that I've got everything that I need. Alright, so our lay plan of our cut fabric should look like this. 2 3 inch by 3 inch rectangles, 1 light brown, 1 dark brown. And then we have 4 rectangles measuring 3 inch by 1.5 inch in our light brown. And then we have 4 rectangles measuring 1 inch by 3 inches in our dark brown. Alright, let's move on to attaching our fabrics. Now we move on to the sewing portion of this project. So what I'm going to do to start off is take my dark brown square and one of the dark brown rectangles and put my right sides together, aligning the 3 inch side of my rectangle with one of the edges of the 3 inch square. Because we're working with such small proportions, it's really important to make sure that things line up absolutely perfectly. So once I can see that my sides are lined up, I'll then flip it over and make sure that my rectangle isn't hanging over the edge here. So I've got that pretty lined up perfectly. And with this stitch, one important thing that I'm going to mention right from the start is that we're going to actually start sewing not only with a 1/4 inch seam, but also starting our seam a 1/4 inch in from the edge of our fabric going this way. So our first stitch, meaning where our needle will drop first, should hit about here. And the reason for that is because we're sewing a 3D shape and it is a box. We need these edges left so that we can sew together our side seams. In terms of machine settings, I have got my needle sitting directly in the center of my foot. I've got a stitch length of 2.5 and the width at a 3.5. The reason that this is at a 3.5 is because I'm working with a 7mm foot and 3.5 means that it's sitting dead in the center. As I'm doing these seams, I'm going to be using, I will just remove my foot, the 1/4 inch seam guide just here. That might be a bit tricky to see, but I'm sure you can see it on your sewing machine. So I'll just reattach my foot. And what I'll do is I'll just pay close attention to where I'm placing my fabric. Oh, I can just see that scooted forward a little bit. There we are. And so that's sitting at about a 1/4 inch away vertically and vertically and horizontally away from my edges. So what I'll do is I'll go forward 3 times, and then I'll do 3 back. The reason I'm being so intentional with how many stitches I'm doing for my back tack is to ensure that I don't go too far back or too far forward. So now that we've done that, I'm going to go right until I reach this point here, which is a 1/4 inch from our side here and a 1/4 inch from our side here. All right. Now, if you're ever unsure of whether you've come far enough or gone too far, when your needle's down in your fabric like this, you can always lift your foot up and inspect like this. So I can see that I need to go forward probably just 1 more stitch. Beautiful. And then what I'm going to do is hit my back tack, go back 3, and then forward 3. Beautiful. So now I'll raise my needle, remove my project from underneath the foot, and trim my threads. So that's our first side done. Now, attaching our second side takes a little bit of precision with this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push my rectangle out like this and just use my finger to make sure that it's sitting as far that way as possible, and our seam here is sitting directly on the inside of that fold. Just like so. Another important thing to mention is that our seam allowance here, meaning the fabric that sits between our raw edge and our stitch, needs to be facing the rectangle, because if it's facing inwards towards the square like this, then we're going to run into trouble later on. So we'll want to make sure that it sits facing outwards like so. And I'm just going to trim that thread because it is annoying me. And then we'll flip it over to the right side. We then take our next rectangle and do exactly the same. Once we've got one of our sides attached, it does make it a lot easier to make sure that we are getting that 1/4 inch seam at the end of our stitch, because we get given a little ridge here because of the fold. And so once I've got my fabric lined up like so, I'll apply some pressure to hold my fabric in place and just use my fingernail, I'll move my fingers there, just to kind of create a mark using a crease as our stop point. Because what we don't want to do is sew onto our fold here. So we want to kind of stop sewing here. All right, let's go. All right, so that's our second side attached. Now you can see I didn't go directly to the edge of this, but if I'd done 1 stitch further, I believe we would have hit our folded edge here of our first rectangle, and that is a bigger issue than having a little gap here. So with that one done, I'm going to do the same to our second rectangle that we did to our first by just finger pressing it over so the right side is facing up, ensuring that my seam allowance is facing towards our rectangle. And then I'm going to apply our third one. Also, before I start, I thought I'd mention, if you're wondering exactly where that 1/4 inch mark is and whether you need to be super precise with it, once you've been sewing for a little while, you tend to get the ability just to eyeball it. But if you're brand new to sewing, I would probably recommend marking in where our 1/4 inch line is on all of just the sides of your rectangles, if you feel like you'd be more comfortable with that. But if you can kind of eyeball where a square would be here, using where we know our needle will drop, which is right here, because I've got that lined up in the center. Oh, wait, there we go. So the line will be here, and then if I go across like that, I can see that I've created an equilateral square just there. And so just using that, I can eyeball it and get my perfect 1/4 inch around both the vertical and horizontal edge down perfectly. I'm just going to use my fingernail to create that ridge. So once again, I have stopped 1/4 inch away from the edge of my fabric here, as well as maintained a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. So we'll move on to attaching our 4th side now. All right, so attaching our 4th side can be either the easiest or the hardest step in this process that we're doing at the moment, depending on the type of sewer that you are. So we're making sure, again, that our seam allowances are pushed out facing our rectangles. And our seams that we've just sewn are sitting directly on the inside of that fold. So we can give that a good finger press. If you're feeling unconfident about how your project is sitting, or you're using a thicker type of fabric, giving it a press with an iron or steam press can definitely help get those edges sitting nice and flat. But because we're using a lightweight cotton with this one, I am finding that just a finger press is fine, just for me specifically. All right, so when placing our 4th rectangle, what we're going to do is make sure a 1/4 inch sits over this side of our fold and a 1/4 inch sits over this side of our fold. So I'll lay this down like so. Now the reason I said that this one can be a little bit tricky earlier is because we aren't working with a direct raw edge. So lining up this piece and making sure that it sits exactly where it needs to be can be a little bit difficult for some people. So now I know that I've got my 1/4 inch either side of my fold. I'm going to position it underneath like so. And I'm going to start sewing. Now, when finishing our seams, I thought I'd also just mention, sorry, there's a lot of tips in this video. When we are doing our back tack at the end of our seam, it's important to go back 3 or 4 and then forward again 3 or 4, just to make sure that we lock down our seam with just a little bit of extra durability, because the last thing we want with projects like this is our stitching coming undone and there being holes or just things that take away from the overall quality of our project. So now that I've finished this, I am going to remove the project from underneath the presser foot, trim my threads using the blade on the side here, and also go around and just trim the threads off of my project. So you should have something that looks a little bit like this. A square with 4 equal rectangles sitting on each of its sides. So now that we've finished with that, we're going to move on to our light brown fabric. Now the process for sewing our light brown rectangles and squares is a slight bit different to the way that we sewed our dark brown ones here. Because what we're going to do is follow exactly the same process we did for this one here, except we are not going to attach this 4th side here. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, but not 4. We're using exactly the same measurements and exactly the same technique of sitting 1/4 inch in from both our horizontal and vertical raw edge, and making sure that our seam allowance is pushed out towards our rectangle. So, just like we did with our dark brown, I've got my seam allowance pushed out towards my rectangle, and that seam is sitting directly in the center of that fold. So now I'm going to go and attach the other 2 sides, and I'll meet you back when we're going to have a discussion about the 4th. So, once we've finished sewing with our light brown fabric, we should have something that looks like this. Very similar to our dark brown square and rectangles, except one side is missing. All right, so what I'm going to do is set this over to the side. Now we move on to marking up our dark brown fabric. So the reason that we're marking this up is to make sure that our ribbon that will act as our cross for our hot cross bun sits directly in the center of each 4 of our sides. So the way that we do that is quite simple. All we do is fold our fabric in half horizontally, making sure that the edges of our rectangles, I'll just move my finger there, match up like so. We'll then take either our chalk or our erasable fabric marker and just put a little mark directly on the inside of the fold. I'll do the same to this side. And as you can see, we've got 2 very small marks just sitting right there. We'll do the same to the other side that was initially sitting vertically. Right, I'm just going to make that a bit darker. All right, so we should have 1, 2, 3, 4 little marks there. What I'm then going to do is take my ribbon, both pieces, and place them facing with the right side down on the table. I'm going to do a cross like so. We then take our dark brown portion of our project and place it facing down like so. We will then take our pins or fabric clips and just pin our ribbon so that the center of the ribbon sits directly on where our little black mark is. So what I'm going to do, and there's a reason for this, is I'm going to go round in a anti-clockwise or clockwise direction. And the reason that we don't go 1, 2, 3, 4 is because of a step that I'm going to show you in just a second. So I will pin. It's also a good idea not to pin too close to the edge of the fabric so that when we go to sew it, we can actually leave our pins in there without the chance of us running over them. So now that I have these two sides pinned down here, a little thing that I like to do to make sure that our project at the end doesn't just look like a big ball is to pull our ribbon a little bit tighter than it usually would if it was sitting flat. So right now, that's sitting quite flat underneath our dark brown portion of our project. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my project and slide it up just slightly. And I'm talking like 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 inch up, just so there is a bit of bunching happening with my dark brown portion of my project. I'm then going to pin that in place. And do the same for our 4th and final. There we go. I'm just going to move my pin just a little bit further down. There we go. All right. Now, that may not look like it is sitting entirely even, but all of these excess bits of ribbon that are sticking out on the sides are going to get cut anyway. So as long as our ribbon is sitting directly in the center of our markings that we've made, that is all that's important right now. So if I flip that over, I can see that my right sides of my ribbon are facing up as well as the right side of my project facing up. So now what I'm going to do is take this to our sewing machine and attach our ribbon. All right, now that we've got everything pinned, we're going to take this to our sewing machine. So the first thing that I'm going to do is change my stitch settings so that our needle sits as far to the left as possible. On the machine I'm working on, all I had to do was dial that down to 1 and it went all the way that way. If you're working with a mechanical machine or a machine that doesn't have that function, just moving your stitch width down to 0 will do exactly the same thing and it'll do the trick. So, sewing in our ribbon, we're going to do something called an edge stitch. And what that entails is sewing a little stitch here that is made up entirely of a back tack, going just forward about 5 or 6 stitches, back 5 or 6 stitches, and then forward again 5 or 6 stitches, right on the edge of our fabric. The reason that we do this is because we can actually leave that stitch in place without having to unstitch it later, because it'll be incorporated into a seam allowance later on in the project. So I'm going to go around and do that to all 4 sides. So, as we can see here, our edge stitch is on the very edge of our fabric, just here. Almost looks like it's coming off the edge. So I'm going to go around and complete that on the other 3 sides, and we can meet back after. Alright, so we have finished all 4 of our edge stitches. And what I'm going to go and do is trim all of my threads. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is just remove those pins that I had in my project. Pop them back in my little pin bird. So the next step that I'm going to do is trim off any of my excess ribbon, leaving about 1/4 of an inch worth of ribbon on the outside of our edge stitch. So I'm going to go like this. All right, all done. Now, before you go and sound off in the comments saying that none of these are even, we don't need to be too precious about this step. So I just race through it because it's all going to be included on the inside of our project. So now we move on to the portion of the project where we're sewing together our sides. I'm going to be starting with the dark brown portion of our project just because it's already in front of my machine and in my hands. So to do this, what we're going to do is actually pick up the square from the back here and pull it out like so, and then align the right sides of our sides together. Now, the reason that we put so much attention to detail into pulling this bit of our square out is because we don't want any of our fabric to get caught in the stitch line that we're about to do on the sides. This is also exactly why we had to leave 1/4 of an inch both horizontally and vertically when we were attaching our sides. Because what we need is that freedom of, let me see if I can show you guys, the freedom of these side seams here that sit at about 1/4 of an inch. Because those are the parts that we are attaching like so. And if they get sewn down, we could technically try and sew them together, but it will not give us an equal 3D shape, which is what we're trying to achieve with this. And it also just won't look very nice. So, pinching our sides together with our right sides together and ensuring that our square portion of our project isn't caught in the middle. I'm then going to lay my side down like so, with the raw edges that we've got matched up facing inwards towards the machine. And the reason that we do this is because we can actually use our pre-existing stitch lines as our kind of finish line for where we're going to be sewing. We're also going to make sure that we take our needle and ensure that it's back in our middle position and we're lining up with our 1/4 inch measurement on our plate here. There's also no need to start in any specific place. We're starting on the edge of our raw edge just here. So, now that I've reached that junction where our pre-existing seam is and our new seam has been placed down via our needle, I'm just going to do a quick back tack, going back 2 or 3 and then forward the exact same amount that we went back. And the reason that we have to be very conscious of this is because if we go too far forward or don't go far enough forward, we could either have puckering or seams come loose, and it just ruins the whole, just the overall quality of the project. So it's really good to be conscious of how far we're going back and ensuring we do exactly the same amount of stitches going forward. So with that, I will remove the project from underneath. then we're also going to do it to the sides of our pre-sewn light brown fabric. And once we get to this fourth side, this is where we attach this bad boy here. So I'll meet you guys there when we're attaching this. All right, so once we've finished that process, we should have something that looks like this, with all four sides attached, and then something that looks like this. Almost exactly the same as our dark brown, except we're missing a side. Now, don't worry too much, because this is where we start to attach our fourth side. So, what we're going to do is we're going to fold our rectangle out as best we can without pushing on this seam too hard because we don't want it to rip. And we're going to line up, just like so. I'll try and get my hands out of the way. Our fourth rectangle with its right side facing the right side of the pre-sewn one. Directly on top, ensuring that underneath this seam allowance is still facing out towards the rectangle. And what we're going to do is we're going to attach this one, starting at the raw edge here and going down to, like we did in the beginning, leaving a seam allowance of 1/4 inch horizontally and vertically. So we'll start here and finish here. All right, now once we've got that side sewn, what we're going to do is take the side that is yet to be sewn and lay it on top of the other side, which our project can get a little bit twisted at this stage. So it's good to just make sure that our fabric here hasn't twisted itself under or done anything of that nature, because the last thing we want is have to restitch this. So I will take that raw edge here, place it on top like so. And this time, just because of the orientation in which we are sewing this, our process reverses. So we're going to be starting on the edge of our ridge, which is just here, where we're leaving 1/4 inch horizontal and vertical and sewing down to the end here. Again, one thing I like to do is create a little ridge with my fingernail, or if you really want to be specific and you really are working with a fabric that doesn't want to crease here, you can just use your marker to mark where that ridge begins. All right. All right, So now we should have something that looks very similar to this piece here, but we have an opening on the side that needs to be attached to our square. So now what I'm going to do is take both of my pieces, trim off all of the loose threads that I can find on the project, and also trim off our corners. So what we're going to do here to ensure that we do get nice flush corners for our 3D shape is snip a little equilateral triangle like so off of the seam allowance of each of our corners. It's important to note that you've just got to be very careful that you don't snip into your stitching, otherwise your project will result in having holes in it. The way that I like to do this, because we've got to trim all 3 corners in all 4 of the junctions of both shapes, is I like to fold down initially the ones from our side seams, trim off an equilateral triangle off of our square, and then I take my project like so and pinch it exactly the same way that I was when I was attaching my side seams, and then trim off my equilateral triangles one by one. So we should have a junction that ends up looking like this. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right, now that we've trimmed all of the corners off of both of our shapes and removed all of our loose threads, it's time to lay them up so that we can attach our light brown section to our dark brown section. So the first step of this part of the process is turning our dark brown section right side out. So as you can see at the moment, it is not. So let's get onto that. One thing I like to do when turning out a 3D shape is to pay close attention to making sure that our corners are turned out fully. To do this, all we have to do is place our index finger inside the corner there, place our thumb on the junction corner there, and then turn out, pushing our seam as far out as possible without exposing the teeth of our stitch line. So we'll do that to all 4 corners. All right, there we go. That's looking a lot better. And as you can see, our hot cross bun appearance and shape is slowly starting to come together, which is exciting. So what we're going to do now is take our light brown section and place the dark brown section inside. And what we're going to try and do is make sure that the junctions where our side seams are match up perfectly with each other. So that means the junction for our light brown fabric here matches up perfectly with our dark brown one here. All right, there we are. Now, one final little check I like to do before I start sewing is making sure that all of our raw edges are as even and in line with each other as possible, and all of our corners still match exactly how we need them to. All right. To ensure that our fabric doesn't creep and come out of alignment, I like to use little fabric clips to hold everything in place, like so. And you only need about 4, maybe 5 of these because the shape that we're working with is quite small. So now that we've got everything lined up, I'm going to carefully take my shape, fold in the sides a little bit, just so we don't get tangled up with our needle threader or anything that might be going up here machine-wise. And just slowly and gently and align it on our 1/4 inch seam mark. It may seem like that did take me a little while, but perfection during this step is really crucial because this is where you'll see whether or not you've rushed your project or made sure that absolutely everything is perfect before we've started sewing. So I can see that all of my seams match up as perfectly as they can. We've lined up as perfectly with our quarter seam allowance as best we can. And now we're going to begin sewing. It honestly doesn't matter where you actually start your stitching on this project because it'll be on the inside of the project, so it won't be seen. I like to start in the middle because starting at a junction often results in just too much going on and mishaps to arise. All right, so let's go. So we go forward a couple, back a couple, and we will sew along. Now, an important thing that we need to factor in with our junctions here is that if we were to have both of our junctions facing this way or facing that way, we'll end up with a lot of bulk on our seams that, one, if we do get through it, won't look very nice, or two, might actually either break our needle or mess up our stitching that we're doing currently. So what I like to do is, whilst I've got my needle down in the fabric, is just carefully lift up my foot, push the seam of my light brown fabric back towards me, and the dark brown fabric seam allowance from our side seam facing the machine. This is to prevent us sewing through 6 layers of fabric, which can not only be tough for the machine, but also just not very attractive to look at once we've finished the product. So, by splitting our seam allowances to having one sit this way and one sit that way, we're only sewing through 4 at a time. So I'll lower my foot now that I've made sure that those are sitting very nicely, and I'll begin to sew. Another little hint I'll give you now is that when we get to this point where our needle has hit our ribbon, which is our center point of our rectangle, it's always good to just double check and make sure that our junction here matches up perfectly. Because as we're sewing such a small shape that is, as you can see, I don't know if you can see this back here, there's quite a lot of tension and warping happening. It's already been sewn, so we're not sewing that warping or tension down, but it's just the way that we're orientating the project and it looks a bit messy. And what can happen during that time is we can actually shift where we have either clipped our fabric or aligned our fabric, which means that these 2 points here won't necessarily match up by the time we get about halfway around our project. So it's always good to just check and see whether or not they still match up, which I can see that one has shifted a little bit. And just to fix it up, because the last thing we want is to finish our project and then see that our seams don't align. All right, so let's keep going. All right, now we've reached our original starting point. I'm going to hit my back tack to secure that seam, lift my needle up, trim my thread on the side, and using that unsewn 4th rectangle, we're going to turn our project the right side out. I'm inspecting to make sure all of my seams line up, which I can see I've done quite nicely, if I do say so myself. And beautiful. What I like to do before I start filling my project with our pillow fill is using my index finger just to push the corners of all areas of the project out as far as we can, just so that when we do finish up, we have a beautiful cubic or rectangular shape, depending on what measurements you're using. All right, with that sewn, we now move on to filling our little pincushion. All right, now we move on to my favorite part of this project, and that is filling our little pincushion. So what we're going to do is take our pillow fill or hobby fill and just break off small chunks and tightly pack them together like so, and then feed it into our opening. One tip I'll give you guys when it comes to filling our little pincushion is during the initial stages of filling it, I like to make sure that I push the fill up into the corners of the dark brown fabric and down into the corners of our light brown fabric. This will help us get a more robust and more realistic 3D shape. Because if we start just pushing it all into the middle, often you'll find that your corners will round and you'll end up with a lot of rounding at the top here, and it'll look more like a softball rather than a hot cross bun. All right. So because we're making a pincushion rather than a plushie, it's important to get as much fill in there as we can without augmenting or warping the shape. So I think I'm getting quite close to that line. I might even actually take some out of that. There we go. Just flatten that out a little bit. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So as you can see here, we don't have any creasing, we don't have any warping. We do here, but that'll be able to be fixed once we've hand sewn this shut. But yeah, voila. Now we move on to the final step, which is closing up the seam here. For this, you're going to need some thread and a hand sewing needle. So the first step of this process is honestly taking a deep breath, because we are about to enter the trenches. If you are like me and really dislike hand sewing, this is going to be something that is going to test us. But that's okay, because that's what sewing is about. So the first thing that I'm going to do is figure out where I want my seam to be. So to do this, all we have to do is use our closed snips to push into our junction like that, so that that point where all three seams meet is sitting directly on the center point of that fold, like so. We are then going to take a fabric clip and just hold that in place. We're going to do the same to the other side, ensuring that at least 1/4 of an inch is folded in, and all of our seam allowance is tucked nicely into that seam. Just clip that in place. Now, before we start anything, we want to make sure this rectangle here, although it is a little bit warped and looking a bit funky right now, we want to make sure that it's relatively even in terms of this side here and this side here. Just to make sure that we haven't turned too much under over here and not enough over here. Because what we want is those equal sides that we can find on every other rectangle on this project. Now I can see that that is looking relatively okay. So what I'm going to do is place a third and final clip just in the middle, like so. And now it's time to prep our needle. Another deep breath might be required for this one, because if you are like me and you are a naturally shaky person, this can be quite the... Oh, I got it, never mind. All right. So now that we have our needle prepped, I'm just going to slightly move my peg along and do my initial stitch without moving the amount of seam allowance that I have factored in here. I'm going to do my initial tie-in of our hand stitch on the tucked under seam allowance of one of our sides. This is to ensure that it is hidden, as this is probably the bulkiest part of our hand stitching, and to have it hidden is the best case scenario and makes it look just a whole lot nicer. So I'm just tying a basic knot, like so. Trimming off the majority of the excess and leaving a little tail just so as we apply pressure and tug on our knot. It's also good to make sure that that is really tight. It won't come undone and it will stay nice and secure. But what I will do is tuck it into our project like so. There we are. Oh, still have a tail poking out. There, lovely. So what we're going to do is take our needle and slide it in on the opposite folded edge and just go into the fabric and come out about 3 millimeters down our seam. We pull that through. We then do exactly the same. So what we're going to do is take our needle and go directly across from where that has come out. Puncture into the fabric and come out about 3 millimeters further up our seam. And as you'll see, as I'll try and show you guys here, we start to create almost a ladder in between each side of the seam that we are trying to sew. So I'm going to continue this process of putting our needle directly across on the other side of our seam that we're closing, coming down about 3 millimeters, coming up through the fabric, back down onto the other side, 3 millimeters across, back up, until we've reached the end of our seam. All right, so I have just done my little stitch here, and I'll admit it is not perfect in any way, shape or form, and I can see a little gap here where I probably could have had my stitches a little bit closer. But hey, that's the best thing about sewing, is there's always something to learn for next time. So I'm going to show you guys how to close off your seam. And so all I'm going to do is I have finished my my stitching just here. And so I'm going to go just a millimeter or so over from where I have come up through my fabric. Go through it like so, creating a loop. And then I'm going to pass my needle through that loop and slowly drag that through. There we go. Being careful not to cause any knots or any thread breaks, because breaking at this stage is quite detrimental. The biggest tip that I can give you with hand sewing is that patience truly is the key. And if you have to tug and force and pull and push your needle or thread, you're probably going to end up breaking it. And that is not what we want. So all I've done now is gone through where I did that first knot, and I'm going to do exactly the same process of passing the needle through the loop. And just pulling it slowly, like so. Once I've got my knot tied, what I will do is just trim off my excess thread. And if I was to sell this at a market or give it as a gift, or if this was going to another person or anyone other than me, I would trim this thread tail back or even use a pair of tweezers to push it into the seam so you can't see it. But because this is for personal use, I'm just going to leave that little tail there just so my knot doesn't come undone. All that's left to do is just swish our pillow fill around a little bit, just because it might have come out of alignment or out of order whilst we were hand sewing. And once you have redistributed all of that hobby fill or pillow fill so that you've got a nice looking shape there, you can now say that you are the proud owner of a hot cross bun pin cushion. Sorry, they're still hot from the oven. I don't want to burn myself. I hope you like this project, guys. I found it really fun to do. If you really enjoyed that process and you have a heap of leftover fabric, hey, why don't you make half a baker's dozen? Why not make a baker's dozen? Hey, open up your own fabric bakery if you wish. If you like projects like this, where they're a little bit quirky or a little bit funky, let me know down in the comments and I'll happily do a few more. But until next time, enjoy your hot cross bun pin cushion and I'll see you next time. See ya!